Texas, Mr. Paul, for 5 minutes.
I thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, the Congress is concerned about the debt. The people are concerned about the debt. The markets are concerned about the debt. The world is concerned about the debt and what we're doing here today because we live with a world fiat dollar standard, and so the whole world is engulfed in this very serious problem. I do not understand, though, that if the debt is the problem, and I agree, the debt is the problem, that for us to come here and raise the debt by $2.4 trillion is the solution. That just baffles me. I think it's a distraction because when a country gets indebted to the degree that we're indebted, the country always defaults. This is historic, especially if the country is a significant country. On occasion, a small country will quit sending the checks and they'll go bankrupt. We're not going to do that, but we will default because the debt is unsustainable. This year, it is said that we have a debt increase of $1.6 trillion, but that's not true. If you count what we borrow from the pension funds, the Social Security and highway funds, it's $2 trillion. But if you include the increase in the entitlement obligation, it's $5 trillion. So this is a huge, huge problem. But the argument here is, how do you default? And it is said that if we don't raise the debt limit, we're going to default and not send out the checks. I don't believe that for a minute. Somehow or another, the checks are going to go out. But if you really wanted to live within the technicalities of law, there's a very simple thing you could do. We owe the Federal Reserve $1.6 trillion. Well, that's not a real debt. They bought those Treasury bills with money out of thin air. We could just write that off or quit paying the interest, tide ourselves over and get down to serious business and cut back and live within our means. And that would be a solution. But to increase the national debt will only encourage another type of default. And that's what we're going through. We're engaged in the most difficult and a very bad way of defaulting. And that is through the destruction of the currency. Today, we have an inflation rate of 9%, and that is defaulting. So if a government can default and print money, and if they can get a 50% inflation rate over a period of time, they've cut that debt in half. That is the goal. That is what's happening, and that is very, very serious. Just in these last 3 years in dealing with this crisis, the dollar has been devalued 50% against gold. And gold, of course, is the best measurement of the value of a currency. It's been that way for thousands of years, and it cannot be denied because it's economic law. So we are defaulting. And when the American people go out and start buying goods and services like they are now, they're recognizing they cost a lot of money. So right now, we're in the early stages of rampant inflation, which means we're going to be hit with higher prices and higher interest rates. That is going to be a tax. So I see the only solution, and that is to cut spending. Now, the reason we don't cut spending is one side loves entitlement, and the other side loves war. And even this attempt $100 billion of cuts when we have this huge, huge deficit. But there's no mention of cutting military spending. I don't want to cut defense spending. This military spending doesn't defend us. It makes things worse. Our problem in this country doesn't come only from the Congress. It comes from the people. The people still have a strong appetite for big government programs. They're not willing to cut. They think government can take care of us from cradle to grave and that we can be the policemen of the world. So someday, we as a country, we as a people, and we as a Congress will have to say, what should the role of government be? The founders had a pretty strong suggestion. They wrote a constitution and said the government should be very limited, and the government should be protecting our liberties and providing national defense and a sound currency. We don't do any of that. We've embarked on a course that was destined to end badly, and this is where we are today. So if we don't understand this default will not be because we don't send out the checks. We will send out the checks. It will be defaulted on because people will get their money back, or they will get their Social Security checks, and it won't buy anything. That is much, much worse than facing the fact that we not raise the debt limit and work our way out of this. That is devastating economically, and it's devastating politically, because we just saw a taste of what happens, how the anger is built when you see other countries in Europe now defaulting and can't pay their bills. So this is more significant than ever because we provide the reserve currency of the world.
How would I decide on which troops to come home? And basically, I want them all to come home, but you can't get them all home in the next week. So you do have to have priorities. I would think that the least controversial, you come first. The troops went in to Korea when I was in high school, and they're still there. We don't need troops in South Korea. I mean, they're 10 times, if not 50 times richer than North Korea, and that's a fourth world nation, and here we are subsidizing the South Koreans. So bring them home. Japan, why do we subsidize Japan? Why do we take care of them? Bring them home. Why do we provide this defense for Germany, and they then have more money to take care of their entitlements, and we have less money to take care of our sick people and our elderly? So bring them home. But I'd bring them home. I'd immediately back off from the Middle East. I would say, we are not in a declared war. Why fight these wars? Bin Laden is dead. And the Al-Qaeda, even our CIA says basically not in Afghanistan anymore. Our most recent report from the CIA says that there is no evidence that the Iranians are building a nuclear bomb. So we don't need all this. So I would there's no place that I think should be exempt. I think we should just come home, and we should never allow the president. I would never go to war without the permission of the Congress. The president has an obligation to defend this nation in emergency conditions if you're being attacked. It's been very clear throughout our history. But to engage in war, like in Libya now, and saying, our president now says, oh, I got permission from the United Nations. We shouldn't be doing any of that. We should be quitting that, and we could save hundreds of billions of dollars by doing it. Well, removing it from the jurisdiction of the federal government and allow the states to regulate it like they would alcohol. And, this seems to be strange for a lot of people, but, I'm only going back to 1937 where that's the way it was handled. The states always did this, and I'm motivated strongly also because the states legalize it for the use of medicinal purposes, and it is helpful for people who have cancer and are getting chemotherapy. So this is not a huge radical idea. It's something that was legal for a long, long time. And the war against marijuana causes so much hardship and accomplishes nothing. So I would say that marijuana, as far as causing highway problems, is minuscule compared to alcohol. And yet we knew prohibition of alcohol was very bad. So this is just getting back to a sensible position on how we handle difficult problems. And for me, it should be the states. I've never used the word heroin in my life when I talk about legalizing freedom of choice. And that one, too, was once legal. And, I concluded that argument, and they sort of got the point when I said, when they were making a big deal, your freedom philosophy means somebody, could use heroin. I said, if tomorrow we legalized heroin, how many of you in this audience would use heroin? Of course, nobody would. So, it's a moot point. It's how you regulate things, and whether or not this $1 trillion we spent on the war on drugs, really since the early 1970s, the modern day war on drugs started with Richard Nixon, and it's a catastrophe, just as prohibition of alcohol was a catastrophe. So yes, there are regulations for children and the way the states want to handle it, but it's sort of like saying I believe in the First Amendment. Oh, that means you're pro-pornography or something like that. It's ridiculous. Permitting something to happen doesn't mean that you authorize it or endorse it. It is not endorsement of what people do. I think it's much worse because kids today have an easier time finding marijuana than they can alcohol. And how many cases of drug addictions were prevented prevented by the laws. Do the laws really do it? Would it putting you in prison for about 5 years? Do you think that would have helped you? Would that have cured you? No, this is a medical problem. It's not a legal problem. You shouldn't be a criminal because you have a problem with drugs. So I just don't think putting you in prison would have been helpful at all.
Now, Congress has done what the Fed has done. We've literally injected about $5.3 trillion. And I don't think we got very much for it. The national debt went up $5.1 trillion. Real GDP grew less than 1%. So I don't think we've gotten a whole lot. Unemployment really hasn't recovered. We still have 7 million people that have become unemployed. And one statistic that is very glaring, if you look at the chart, is how long people are unemployed. The average time used to be 17 weeks. Now it's nearly 40 weeks they stay unemployed. So nothing there reassures me. And also, when we talk about prices, we're always reassured there's not all that much inflation, and we're told that they might start calculating inflation differently with a new CPI. Of course, we changed our CPI a few years back. There's still a free market group that calculates the CPI the old-fashioned way, and they come up with a figure. In spite of all this weak economy, the prices have gone up 35%, 9.4% every year. And I think if you just went out and talked to the average housewife, she'd probably believe the 9% rather than saying it's only 2%. So I would say what we've been doing isn't very reassuring with all this money expenditure. But my question is related to the overall policy. Spending all this money hasn't helped, and yet many allies that would endorse so much of what's been going on, whether it's the Fed or the Congress, they recognize that consumer spending is very, very important. And they concentrate on that. But the $5.1 trillion didn't go to the consumers. It went to buying bad assets. It went to bailing out banks. It went to bailing out big companies, and lo and behold, the consumer didn't end up getting this. They lost their job, and they lost their houses and mortgages, and they're still in trouble. But my question is, if you took that $5.1 trillion and said that consumer spending is good, you could have given every single person in this country $17,000. Why is it the program of both the Congress and the Fed to direct the money to the people who have been making a lot of money, instead to the people who, if you argue that the consumer needs to spend the money, I obviously don't advocate this, but I would suggest, maybe it could have worked better. It couldn't have worked any worse. But what is the reason we direct it toward the banks and the big corporations, too big to fail, and we don't pay that much attention to the consumer if it's true, and I don't know if you agree with that or not, that consumer spending is an important issue?
Well, it is an important issue, Congressman, but you're mistaken in saying that the Federal Reserve has spent any money. You say $5 trillion. We have lent money. We have purchased securities. That's not buying. That's not dissipating, the money. We've gotten all the money back. As an article over the weekend by Alan Sloan showed, in fact, the Fed has been a major profit center for the U.S. government. We've turned over profits in the last 2 years of $125 billion. So we are not costing any money in terms of budget deficits or anything like that. In terms of what we were trying to do, of course, the reason the Federal Reserve was founded a century ago was to try to address the problems arising from financial panics, which did, by the way, occur in an unregulated environment in the 19th century. We provided liquidity and short-term loans to help the financial system stabilize. We did that not because we particularly care about the managers or the shareholders of financial firms.
I hate to interrupt when my time is about up. I would like to suggest that you say it's not spending money. Well, it's money out of thin air. You put it into the market, you hold assets, and the assets aren't, they are diminishing in value when you buy up bad assets. But very quickly, if you could answer another question, because I'm curious about this. The price of gold today is $1,580. The dollar during these last 3 years was devalued almost 50%. When you wake up in the morning, do you care about the price of gold?
Well, I pay attention to the price of gold, but I think it reflects a lot of things. It reflects global uncertainties. I think the reason people hold gold is as a protection against what we call tail risk, really, really bad outcomes. And to the extent that the last few years have made people more worried about the potential of a major crisis, then they have gold as protection.
Do you think gold is money?
No.
not money. Even if it's been money for 6,000 years, somebody reversed that and eliminated that economic law.
Well, it's an asset. I mean, it's the same. If you say Treasury bills are money, I don't think they're money either, but they're financial.
Why do central banks hold it?
Well, it's a form of reserves.
So why don't they hold diamonds?
Well, it's tradition, long-term tradition.
Some people still think it's money. I yield back. My time is up.
Thank you.